Evening, friends. Settle yourselves down. Let the fire draw the chill from the room, and the quiet of the night draw the worry from your minds. Tonight, we're not riding into a gunfight, nor tracking outlaws across sun-baked plains. No, our journey takes us into a different kind of wilderness, the landscape of the human heart, a territory often more treacherous, more unpredictable than any mountain pass or desert crossing. We're heading to a small, dusty town in the Wyoming Territory, a place where judgments were as sharp as a new-honed Bowie knife, and whispers could cut deeper than any bullet. This is a story about a choice, a marriage that defied convention, and the quiet, stubborn courage it takes to build a life and find love in the face of scorn, gossip, and the ever-present hardships of the frontier. It's about looking past the surface, past the years that separate, to find the common ground where true affection can take root and blossom, even in the most unlikely soil. The dust of Willow Creek seems every third town out here was named for a tree that probably died of thirst years ago, settled on Amelia Hathaway's bonnet as she stepped down from the stagecoach. It had been a long, bone-jarring journey from back east, a journey fueled by a desperate hope and the fading ink of a correspondence that promised, well, it promised a future. Any future, she'd thought, had to be better than the one she was leaving behind. A life of genteel poverty, of being an unmarried burden on her aging relatives, her prospects dwindling with each passing year. She was 24, an age when spinsterhood loomed like a grim specter in the parlors of Philadelphia. So, she had answered an advertisement. A respectable rancher, a widower in the Wyoming Territory, seeking a wife, a companion, a helpmate. His letters had been formal, reserved, but honest, she'd thought. He'd sent a tintype, a stern-faced man, weathered, his eyes holding a sadness she thought she understood. His name was Jedediah Cutler, and he was 52. The age gap had given her pause, certainly. Her aunt had been scandalized. But Amelia, pragmatic and weary of pitying glances, had seen not an old man, but a chance for a home of her own, a purpose, perhaps even a measure of respectability, however remote. She had packed her few belongings, her worn copies of Shakespeare and Emerson, and boarded the train, then the stage, heading west into the unknown, towards a man almost 30 years her senior, and a town called Willow Creek. He was there to meet her, just as he'd promised. Jedediah Cutler. Taller than his photograph suggested, leaner, his face even more deeply etched by sun and wind and time than she'd imagined. His hair was mostly gray, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his hands, when he hesitantly took her valise, were strong, calloused, capable. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue beneath bushy gray brows, held that same sadness she'd seen in the tintype, but also a keen intelligence and a profound, almost painful shyness. He wasn't handsome, not in any conventional sense. He looked worn, like an old, sturdy tree that had weathered many storms. "Miss Hathaway," he said, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle. He seemed as nervous as she was, perhaps more so. "Welcome to Willow Creek. Trust your journey was tolerable." "Mr. Cutler," Amelia replied, trying to keep her voice steady, offering a small, polite smile. "It was long, but I am here safely, thank you." The exchange was awkward, formal. Around them, on the dusty boardwalk in front of the Willow Creek Mercantile and Post Office, a few townsfolk had gathered, ostensibly to collect their mail or purchase supplies, but their curious, assessing gazes were fixed on the newcomer and the old rancher. Amelia felt their stares like pinpricks. She could almost hear the whispers starting already. The mail-order bride. For old Jed Cutler? Why, she's young enough to be his daughter. The thought brought a flush of heat to her cheeks, a familiar mixture of defiance and embarrassment. Jedediah Cutler, seemingly oblivious to, or perhaps just inured to the town's scrutiny, gestured towards a sturdy buckboard wagon hitched nearby. "My ranch is a ways out. Best be getting on before dark." He loaded her small trunk, helped her up onto the hard wooden seat with a surprising, almost courtly gentleness, then climbed up beside her, taking the reins. He didn't say much as they drove out of Willow Creek, the small town quickly shrinking behind them, replaced by the vast, rolling expanse of sagebrush and prairie, the snow-capped peaks of the Bighorn Mountains, a distant, majestic backdrop. Amelia, stealing glances at the silent man beside her, felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. This was it. This was her new life. A stark cabin on a remote ranch, with a man old enough to be her father, in a community that already seemed poised to judge and condemn their unconventional union. Had she made a terrible mistake? Was this desperate gamble for a future doomed before it even began? The silence in the buckboard, broken only by the creak of the wheels and the jingle of harness, felt heavy with unspoken questions, with the vast, uncertain space between their disparate lives. The wind, sighing through the tall prairie grass, seemed to whisper a warning. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was a sigh of resignation, accepting another two souls cast together by the strange, often harsh currents of frontier fate. The romance, if it could be called that, had begun with a stark transaction, an exchange of letters, and a train ticket. Now, under the vast Wyoming sky, surrounded by the judgment of a small town and the weight of their own unspoken anxieties, Jedediah Cutler and Amelia Hathaway faced the far more difficult task of building not just a marriage, but a life, and maybe, just maybe, finding something akin to love in the most unlikely of circumstances. Jedediah Cutler's ranch, the Lazy Sea, was nestled in a small, sheltered valley carved by a meandering creek that, unlike its namesake in town, actually held water year-round, fed by mountain snowmelt. The cabin was small, sturdier than it looked from a distance, built of weathered logs chinked tightly against the wind. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, promising warmth. A few corrals held a small herd of hardy-looking cattle. A vegetable garden, neatly tended though showing the signs of approaching autumn, lay near the cabin. It was a place of solitude, of hard work, of quiet self-sufficiency. It was also, Amelia quickly realized, a place steeped in a profound, almost palpable loneliness. Jedediah showed her inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished but clean, dominated by a large stone hearth. A rough-hewn table and two chairs, a couple of built-in bunks, shelves holding a few essential pots and pans, a worn Bible, and surprisingly, a small collection of books on animal husbandry and agriculture. It was a man's domain, functional, devoid of any feminine touch. He gestured towards one of the bunks, neatly made up with clean but patched blankets. "This'll be yours," he said gruffly, avoiding her eyes. I sleep out in the lean-to mostly, with the stock. Habit." Amelia understood. The age gap, the awkwardness of their arrangement, the unspoken assumptions. It would take time, if ever, for this to feel like a true marriage, a shared home. She was, for now, an intruder in his solitary world. The first few weeks were a period of careful, silent adjustment. Jedediah was a man of few words, his days dictated by the relentless rhythm of ranch work, tending cattle, mending fences, chopping wood, preparing for the harsh Wyoming winter he warned was fast approaching. He rose before dawn, worked until dusk, his movements economical, his endurance surprising for a man his age. He treated Amelia with a distant, almost formal courtesy, ensuring she had food, shelter, warmth, but offering little else. He ate his meals quickly, silently, then often retreated to the lean-to or busied himself with tasks outside, leaving Amelia to the quiet confines of the cabin. Amelia, in turn, tried to make herself useful, to find her place in this strange new life. She had little experience with ranch work, but she was a quick learner, not afraid of hard labor. She cleaned the cabin meticulously, mended Jedediah's worn clothes with neat stitches, learned to cook over the open hearth using their limited supplies, mostly dried beans, salt pork, and the occasional game Jedediah brought in. She tended the small vegetable garden, carefully preserving what remained of the late harvest. She read her books by the firelight in the long evenings, the silence of the cabin broken only by the crackle of the flames and the distant howl of coyotes. The loneliness was profound, deeper in some ways than the genteel isolation she had known back east. Here, it was amplified by the vastness of the land, the silence of her companion, and the knowledge that she was an outsider, a mail-order bride in a marriage born of necessity rather than affection. She missed the familiar comforts, the intellectual stimulation, the simple companionship of her former life, however constrained it had been. But she was determined not to show her despair, not to complain. She had made her choice. She would endure. She would find a way to make this work. Their occasional trips into Willow Creek for supplies were an ordeal. The town's judgment was palpable, delivered through averted gazes, hushed whispers that ceased abruptly when she approached, the overly polite, almost pitying smiles of the mercantile owner's wife, Mrs. Henderson. She heard the snickers from the loafers outside the saloon. She saw the women of the town gathered in tight, gossiping knots, their eyes following her, dissecting her, condemning her. Old man Cutler and his young bride. What could she possibly see in him? Must be after his land, what little there is. Or maybe she's just desperate. Or worse. The unspoken accusations hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jedediah seemed oblivious to it all, or perhaps simply resigned. He conducted his business, nodded curtly to acquaintances, ignored the stares and whispers, his face a mask of stoic indifference. But Amelia saw the way his shoulders tightened slightly, the way his jaw clenched when he thought she wasn't looking. He felt the scorn, too, she realized, perhaps even more keenly, for bringing this young woman into his solitary life, exposing her to the town's casual cruelty. It created another unspoken layer of distance between them. The only person in Willow Creek who showed Amelia any genuine, unreserved kindness was Sarah Carter, the sheriff's wife, a different Sheriff Carter than the one in Redemption Ridge, for kindness and lawmen can take many forms. Sarah was a plain, hard-working woman, her face weathered by the prairie sun, her hands rough from toil, but her eyes held a warmth and understanding that was a balm to Amelia's bruised spirit. Sarah had lost her own first husband young, knew something of loneliness and hardship. She made a point of speaking to Amelia directly, kindly, asking about her journey, her settling in, ignoring the disapproving glances of the other women. She invited Amelia for tea once, a small act of social defiance that meant the world to the isolated young woman. "Don't you mind them none, dear," Sarah had said, pouring tea in her small, neat kitchen, her voice gentle but firm. "Small towns got small minds sometimes. They fear what they don't understand. Jedediah Cutler, he's a good man. Quiet, keeps to himself but honest. Been through his share of sorrow, I reckon. Lost his first wife and child to the fever years back. Never quite got over it." She looked at Amelia pointedly. "He needs kindness, Amelia. Same as you do. Maybe you two can find some comfort in each other, despite what folks say." Sarah's words offered a flicker of hope, a different perspective. Jedediah, a grieving widower. It explained the deep sadness in his eyes, his reserve, his almost painful shyness. It made him seem less like a remote, aging stranger and more like a fellow soul marked by loss. Perhaps, Amelia thought, there was more to this marriage of convenience than she had initially allowed herself to believe. Perhaps, beneath the layers of age and grief and societal disapproval, a common ground could be found. As the days shortened and the first bite of winter arrived with icy winds sweeping down from the bighorns, life on the lazy sea became even more insular. The trips to Willow Creek grew infrequent. Jedediah and Amelia were thrown into closer proximity, forced to share the warmth of the small cabin more consistently. The silence between them remained, but it began to change, subtly, almost imperceptibly. It became less a silence of awkwardness and more one of shared solitude, of unspoken understanding. Amelia learned to read Jedediah's moods through the set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the slight variations in his gruff pronouncements. She learned that his silence often masked not indifference, but a deep-seated shyness, a reluctance to intrude, perhaps even a fear of rejection. She saw the way his gaze sometimes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, a flicker of something unreadable, curiosity, longing, regret, in his clear blue eyes. He, in turn, began to notice her more, noticed her quiet competence, her resilience, the way she never complained despite the harshness of her new life. He noticed the way she talked softly to the few chickens she'd started keeping, the way she mended his clothes with such neat, precise stitches, the way her face lit up when she read her worn books by the firelight, her lips sometimes moving silently, lost in another world. He started leaving small offerings for her, a handful of late autumn berries he'd found, a particularly interesting bird feather, a piece of strangely shaped driftwood from the creek bank. Silent gestures, but they spoke volumes. One evening, a fierce early blizzard descended upon the valley, trapping them in the cabin for days. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the shutters, driving snow against the log walls. They huddled near the fire, the small space filled with the roar of the storm. The enforced proximity, the shared vulnerability, seemed to break through some of the remaining barriers between them. Driven by a need to fill the silence, or perhaps by a deeper loneliness, Amelia began to read aloud from her book of Shakespeare, her voice surprisingly clear and expressive in the small cabin. Jedediah, initially surprised, listened intently, his usual task of mending harness forgotten, his gaze fixed on the fire, but his attention clearly captured. He had likely never heard such words, such stories. When she finished a passage, he would often sit in silence for a long moment, then ask a hesitant, surprisingly insightful question about the characters, their motives, their fates. They began to talk, truly talk, not just about the necessities of ranch life, but about ideas, about dreams, however faded, about the wider world beyond their isolated valley. Amelia discovered a keen, untutored intelligence in Jedediah, a deep well of observation and quiet wisdom gleaned from years of solitary communion with the land. He, in turn, seemed to find a strange comfort, a reawakening of some long-dormant part of himself, in her voice, her stories, her unexpected companionship. The storm eventually passed, but something had shifted between them. The silence was still there, but it was a different kind of silence now, easier, more companionable, punctuated by shared glances, occasional brief smiles, a growing sense of mutual reliance. They were still Jedediah Cutler, the aging rancher, and Amelia Hathaway, his young mail-order bride. But perhaps, just perhaps, they were also becoming friends, partners, maybe even something more, something neither of them had dared to name or even hope for. The Wyoming winter, harsh and unforgiving, had forced them together, and in that enforced intimacy, against the backdrop of societal scorn and their own internal fears, the first fragile tendrils of an unlikely affection were beginning to take root, as unexpected and resilient as a wildflower blooming in barren rock. The tentative peace, the fragile budding of understanding between Jedediah and Amelia, was soon threatened, not just by the harsh Wyoming winter that settled over the lazy sea with relentless ferocity, but by the escalating malice of Willow Creek, and by a new, more tangible danger that arrived with the snows. Their next trip into town for essential supplies, flour, salt, lamp oil, ammunition, was even more of an ordeal than usual. The gossip had clearly festered, fueled by winter confinement and small-town boredom. Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile, usually just coolly polite, was now openly dismissive, her questions about Amelia's adjustment laced with pointed insinuation. The other women in the store fell silent when Amelia entered, their whispers resuming immediately as she passed, sharp and venomous as snakebite. "Poor thing," one clucked, loud enough for Amelia to hear. "Trapped out there with that old man. Must be desperate for his money, though Lord knows he ain't got much." Another added with a cruel little laugh, "Or maybe she likes him old and grizzled. Some do, I hear." Amelia felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, but this time something new mingled with the shame, a spark of anger, of defiance. She met their stares coolly, completed her purchases with quiet dignity, and walked out of the store, her head held high, her slight limp perhaps a fraction more pronounced due to her inner turmoil rather than physical strain. Jedediah, waiting outside with the buckboard, saw the flush on her cheeks, the tightness around her lips. He didn't say anything, but his jaw hardened, and he loaded their supplies with a grim, almost violent efficiency. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not awkward, but charged, heavy with unspoken resentment of the town's cruelty. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Amelia mending, Jedediah cleaning his rifle, he finally broke the silence. "Don't you pay them no mind, Amelia," he said gruffly, not looking at her. "Folks in town, they got tongues sharper 'n a skinning knife, and minds narrower 'n a canyon trail. They don't know nothing about us. About you. It was the closest he had come to acknowledging the town's scorn and to defending her. Amelia looked up, surprised by his uncharacteristic outburst. It doesn't matter, Jedediah, she said, though her voice trembled slightly. Their words can't hurt us out here. But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The isolation of the ranch was a refuge, but also a vulnerability. They depended on Willow Creek for supplies, for news, for the occasional human contact, however unwelcome. And the town's disapproval, its constant, corrosive judgment, created a barrier, a sense of being besieged that was hard to ignore. The real threat, however, arrived not in the form of whispers, but on horseback a few weeks later. 3 riders, strangers to the valley, heavily armed, with faces as hard and unyielding as the frozen ground. They rode up to the Lazy Sea cabin late one afternoon, just as Amelia was bringing in firewood, and Jedediah was tending to a sick calf in the small barn. Their leader, a tall, rangy man with cold, watchful eyes and a sneer that seemed permanently etched on his face, dismounted and swaggered towards Amelia. "This the Cutler place?" he demanded, his voice rough, insolent. Amelia, startled and frightened, nodded wordlessly. Shadow, who had been dozing near the woodpile, rose with a low growl, positioning himself between her and the strangers. "Call off the dog, missy," the man sneered, his hand dropping casually towards the gun holstered on his hip. "We ain't here to hurt you, just looking for Cutler. Got business with him." Jedediah emerged from the barn then, wiping his hands on a piece of sackcloth, his face grim, his eyes narrowed as he took in the armed strangers, their horses lathered as if they'd ridden hard. "I'm Cutler," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What business you got with me?" The leader looked Jedediah up and down with open contempt, his gaze lingering on Jedediah's age, his weathered appearance. "Name's Blackwood," the man said. "Reckon you remember a man named Silas Croft, from back in the Nevada Silver Strikes? Seems he ain't forgotten you, Cutler, or the claim you supposedly jumped on him." Jedediah's face tightened, a flicker of old anger, old pain in his eyes. Croft, a name from a past he thought long buried, a past filled with betrayal, violence, and stolen dreams. Amelia saw the change in him, the sudden tension that radiated from his usually stoic frame. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was a ghost from Jedediah's past, come to haunt them. "Croft was a liar and a cheat," Jedediah said, his voice low and dangerous. "That claim was mine, fair and square. He tried to kill me for it, left me for dead." Blackwood chuckled humorlessly. "That ain't the story Croft tells. He says you were the claim jumper, the backstabber, and he ain't a man to let old debts go unpaid. He sent us to collect, with interest." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "The way we see it, Cutler, everything you got here, this ranch, these cattle, even this young wife of yours." His eyes flicked towards Amelia with a lewd insinuation that made her blood run cold. "It all rightfully belongs to Croft, as compensation for what you stole." "This is my land," Jedediah stated, his voice like granite. "Bought and paid for with honest work. Croft ain't got no claim here. You tell him that. Now get off my property." Blackwood's sneer widened. "Not so fast, old man. We ain't leaving empty-handed." He gestured to his 2 companions who dismounted, their rifles held ready, spreading out to flank Jedediah. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Your choice. But either way, we're taking what Croft sent us for." He clearly expected no real resistance from the aging rancher and the young woman. He underestimated them both, profoundly. The confrontation escalated quickly. Jedediah, despite his age, was not a man to be easily intimidated. He had faced down hardship, betrayal, and the harshness of the wilderness for decades. He wouldn't surrender what was his, what he had built with his own hands, without a fight. And Amelia, though terrified, found a core of righteous anger burning through her fear. This was her home now, however unconventional, however difficult. These men, with their casual brutality, their arrogant assumptions, were threatening not just Jedediah, but her future, her fragile sense of belonging. As Blackwood took another menacing step towards Jedediah, Shadow, loyal and fearless, launched himself at the man's leg with a ferocious snarl, sinking his teeth deep. Blackwood yelled in pain and surprise, stumbling back, trying to kick the dog off. His two men raised their rifles, but hesitated, unsure whether to shoot for fear of hitting their leader. Jedediah seized the momentary distraction. He moved with surprising speed, lunging not for a gun, but for the heavy axe he'd been using to split wood, which lay propped against the cabin wall. He swung it in a wide, desperate arc, not aiming to kill, but to create space, to drive the attackers back. One of Blackwood's men jumped aside, narrowly avoiding the whistling blade. The other, caught off guard, took the flat of the axe against his rifle barrel, the impact jarring the weapon from his grasp. "Amelia, inside! Get the rifle!" Jedediah roared, shoving her towards the cabin door. Amelia didn't hesitate. She scrambled inside, her heart pounding, fumbling for the old Winchester Jedediah kept loaded above the hearth. Her hands shook as she took it down, the cold metal unfamiliar but strangely reassuring. She'd practiced with it a few times, under Jedediah's patient tutelage, learning to load, aim, fire, though she was far from proficient. Now, facing real danger, the lessons came flooding back. Outside, the fight was desperate. Blackwood, having finally dislodged Shadow, who now circled, barking furiously looking for another opening, drew his pistol, firing wildly at Jedediah. Jedediah, using the woodpile for cover, parried Blackwood's clumsy attacks with the axe handle, searching for an opening, trying to reach the rifle propped against the barn door. The two disarmed ranch hands scrambled for their dropped weapons or drew sidearms. Amelia emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand, just as Blackwood managed to corner Jedediah against the barn wall, his pistol leveled. "Time to pay your dues, old man," Blackwood snarled. "No!" Amelia screamed, raising the Winchester, her fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of protective fury. She didn't aim carefully, didn't think. She just pointed the rifle in Blackwood's direction and pulled the trigger. The roar of the Winchester surprised them all, including Amelia. The shot went wide, splintering the barn wall harmlessly above Blackwood's head. But it was enough. Blackwood flinched, momentarily distracted, his aim wavering. It was the opening Jedediah needed. He lunged forward under Blackwood's gun, tackling the bigger man hard, sending them both sprawling into the dusty corral. The fight devolved into a brutal, desperate brawl. Jedediah, though older, fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, his years of hard labor giving him a surprising strength. Amelia, after her initial shot, found herself frozen, watching in terror as Jedediah and Blackwood wrestled in the dust, fists flying, grunts of pain and effort echoing in the cold air. Shadow darted in and out, snapping at the legs of the other two gunmen, who were now trying to get clear shots at Jedediah without hitting their leader. One of the gunmen finally managed to raise his rifle, taking aim at the struggling figures in the corral. Amelia saw him, saw the cold determination in his eyes. Without thinking, she raised the Winchester again, this time trying to remember Jedediah's instructions. Breathe, aim, squeeze. She fired. The bullet struck the gunman in the shoulder, spinning him around, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the sky as he fell, cursing in pain. Her shot, though perhaps lucky, seemed to turn the tide. The remaining gunman, seeing his partner down, seeing his leader still struggling with the surprisingly strong old man, and now facing a woman with a rifle who had proven she could use it, hesitated. His nerve broke. He turned and fled, scrambling onto his horse and galloping away down the valley, abandoning his companions. Blackwood, seeing his last man desert him, knowing he was now facing Jedediah, the enraged dog, and the armed woman alone, seemed to lose his fight. Jedediah, seizing the advantage, landed a solid blow to Blackwood's jaw. The man sagged, dazed. Jedediah quickly disarmed him, then hauled him roughly to his feet. Silence fell, broken only by the harsh, ragged breathing of the combatants, Shadow's low growls, and the distant sound of the retreating gunman's horse. Amelia stood trembling, the heavy Winchester still clutched in her hands, smoke curling from its barrel, the acrid smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. She had shot a man, twice. The realization was shocking, terrifying, yet strangely empowering. She had defended her home, her husband, herself. Jedediah, breathing heavily, secured the dazed Blackwood and the wounded gunman with rope from the barn. He looked at Amelia, his blue eyes holding a mixture of shock, concern, and a dawning, profound respect. "You all right, Amelia?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, unable to find her voice, still trembling from the adrenaline. You saved my life," he said quietly, looking at the Winchester in her hands, then back at her face. "Twice." He paused, a slow, rare smile touching his lips, a smile that transformed his weathered face, erasing years of sadness. Reckon you ain't just a mail-order bride, Miss Hathaway. Reckon you're a true Wyoming woman now." In the aftermath of the gunfight, a new understanding, a deeper bond, settled between Jedediah and Amelia. They had faced death together, defended each other, proven their mettle. The awkwardness, the reserve, the unspoken barriers of age and circumstance seemed to have been burned away in the heat of the battle, replaced by a raw, mutual respect and a dawning, undeniable affection. They were no longer just a rancher and his convenient wife. They were partners, comrades, survivors. They tended to the wounded gunman. Blackwood remained sullen and uncooperative. Then Jedediah rode into Willow Creek to fetch Sheriff Thompson. Yet another sheriff for lawmen like Troubles came in many forms across the territories. The town was abuzz with the news of the gunfight at the Lazy Sea, the story already embellished by the cowardly gunman who had fled. When Jedediah arrived with his prisoners, and Sheriff Thompson later returned with Amelia's clear, concise account of the unprovoked attack and their desperate defense, the town's attitude towards the Cutlers underwent a profound shift. The whispers didn't stop entirely, but now they were tinged with awe, with grudging respect. The quiet, aging rancher and his young, genteel wife had faced down armed thugs, defended their home. They were not figures of pity or scorn anymore. They were figures of strength, of courage. Sarah Carter, the sheriff's wife, was one of the first to visit the Lazy Sea after the incident, bringing a basket of freshly baked bread and a pot of stew, her face alight with concern and admiration. "Amelia, dear," she said, enfolding Amelia in a warm hug. "I heard what happened. You were so brave, both of you." She looked from Amelia to Jedediah, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Seems this Wyoming air agrees with you after all." Even Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile offered a grudging apology for her past coolness, pressing a tin of expensive store-bought cookies into Amelia's hand. The town, it seemed, was slowly, reluctantly, beginning to accept their unconventional marriage, recognizing the genuine bond that had been forged in shared adversity. But the threat from Silas Croft, the Nevada silver baron, not the Verdant Creek cattleman, still loomed. Blackwood and his wounded companion were locked in Sheriff Thompson's flimsy jail, awaiting the circuit judge. But Croft was a powerful man, with long reach and a longer memory. He wouldn't take this defeat lightly. Jedediah knew Croft would likely send more men, better armed, more ruthless. The Lazy Sea, for all its newfound respectability in Willow Creek, was still an isolated ranch, vulnerable to a determined attack. "We can't stay here, Amelia," Jedediah said one evening, as they sat by the fire, the cabin feeling both safer and more precarious than ever before. "Not for long. Croft won't let this go. He'll want revenge. For Blackwood, for the humiliation. He'll keep sending men until he gets what he wants." His face was grim. The past he had tried to outrun, the past he had hoped to bury in the solitude of the Lazy Sea, had caught up with him, and now it threatened to destroy not just him, but Amelia too. "Then what do we do, Jedediah?" Amelia asked, her heart sinking. She had just begun to feel a sense of belonging here, a fragile hope for a future. Must they run again? Jedediah stared into the fire for a long time, his expression troubled. There's a place," he said finally, his voice low. "A valley I know. High up in the Bighorns. Hidden. Defensible. Good water. Game. I found it years ago, when I first came to this territory, looking for a place to disappear." He hesitated. "It's rough country. Hard to reach. Harder to live in, especially through the winter. But it might be safe." safer than here. A hidden valley? Amelia murmured. Can we make it? Before Croft sends more men? We'd have to travel light, fast, Jedediah said. Leave most everything behind. Just the essentials. The cattle. We'd have to sell them. What few there are. For trail money. It'd be starting over. Again. With nothing but what we can carry on our backs and a couple of pack mules. He looked at her, his blue eyes searching her face. It ain't much of a life to offer you, Amelia. Hardship. Isolation. Constant vigilance. Amelia met his gaze steadily. She thought of the scorn in Willow Creek, the loneliness of her life before, the terror of the attack by Blackwood's men. Then she thought of Jedediah's quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, the growing warmth she felt in his presence, the respect he now showed her. She thought of the partnership they had forged, defending their home, their lives, side by side. Jedediah, she said softly, any life with you, a life where we are respected, where we are safe from men like Croft, is a life worth fighting for. Whatever the hardship, wherever it takes us. She reached out tentatively and laid her hand on his rough, calloused one. He started slightly at her touch, then his fingers closed around hers, his grip surprisingly strong, yet gentle. The emotional twist was profound. Their marriage, begun as a pragmatic arrangement, shadowed by societal disapproval and their own internal barriers, had been transformed by shared danger into a genuine partnership, a bond of mutual respect, trust, and dawning affection. The threat from Croft, far from destroying them, had stripped away the pretenses, revealing the true depth of their connection. Now, they faced a new, even more desperate challenge: to abandon everything they had built, to flee into the wilderness, to seek refuge in a hidden valley, relying only on each other and their shared courage to build a new life, a true sanctuary, far from the reach of past enemies and present dangers. Their journey wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting a love that had blossomed against all odds, in the most unlikely of circumstances. The decision made, Jedediah and Amelia moved with quiet urgency. Jedediah rode into Willow Creek one last time, selling his small herd of cattle to a neighboring rancher for a meager sum, enough for essential supplies for their journey. He settled his account at the mercantile, informing a surprised Mrs. Henderson that he and his wife were moving on, looking for greener pastures. He spoke briefly with Sheriff Thompson, explaining his fear of retribution from Croft, his need to disappear for a time. The sheriff, understanding and perhaps feeling a measure of guilt for the town's earlier treatment of the Cutlers, offered what little help he could: a spare pack mule, some extra ammunition, a warning to keep a low profile and avoid known outlaw trails. He also promised to send word if Blackwood or his man escaped, or if any more of Croft's men were seen in the territory, though he knew his reach was limited. Amelia, meanwhile, packed their few essential belongings: warm clothes, blankets, cooking utensils, her precious books, the Winchester rifle she now handled with a newfound, if still hesitant, confidence, and the small, sturdy walking stick Jedediah had fashioned for her that first winter, a symbol of his quiet care. She looked around the small cabin, the place that had been her first real home in years, with a pang of sadness, but no regret. This cabin represented a beginning, a transition, but their future, their true sanctuary, lay ahead in the hidden valley Jedediah had spoken of. They left the lazy sea under the cover of a moonless night, two figures on horseback, leading two heavily laden pack mules, shadow scouting silently ahead. They avoided Willow Creek, taking a little-used trail that led directly into the rugged foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. Their journey was a deliberate disappearance, an erasure of their past lives, a desperate gamble on an unknown future. The trek into the high country was arduous, testing their endurance to the limit. Jedediah, his knowledge of the wilderness their lifeline, led them through tangled forests, across rushing mountain streams, up steep, rocky passes. Amelia, though often exhausted, her old limp sometimes flaring into painful protest, pushed onward with a quiet determination that continually surprised Jedediah. She learned to read the signs of the trail, to conserve her energy, to move with a new sureness, her senses heightened by the wilderness and her reliance on Jedediah's guidance. Shadow, ever loyal, ranged ahead, his warnings often alerting them to difficult terrain or the presence of wildlife before they encountered it. They traveled for days, seeing no sign of pursuit, but the fear of Croft's retribution was a constant shadow at their backs. They spoke little, conserving their breath for the climbs, their communication often a shared glance, a pointed gesture, an unspoken understanding that had grown between them. In the evenings, they made cold camps in sheltered hollows, sharing meager rations, huddling together for warmth against the biting mountain wind, the silence of the vast wilderness broken only by the crackle of their small, carefully concealed fire and the distant cry of a hunting owl. During these quiet evenings, the last vestiges of reserve between them seemed to melt away. They talked more freely than ever before, sharing stories of their past lives, their hopes, their fears. Amelia spoke of her constrained upbringing in Philadelphia, her yearning for purpose, her initial trepidation about coming west. Jedediah, in turn, haltingly at first, then with growing ease, spoke of his own past, his early dreams, the betrayal by Croft that had shattered his life and driven him into years of solitary wandering, the profound loneliness he had endured before Amelia's arrival. He spoke of his first wife, Sarah, and their child, lost to the fever so many years ago, the grief still a raw wound in his soul. Amelia listened, her heart aching with a deep compassion, understanding now the source of the sadness in his eyes, the walls he had built around himself. She reached out, taking his rough hand in hers, offering silent comfort, a shared understanding of loss and resilience. He didn't pull away. You remind me of her sometimes, Amelia," Jedediah said one night, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Not in looks, no, but in spirit, her gentleness, her strength. I thought I'd never feel that again." He looked at her then, his blue eyes, usually so guarded, now open, vulnerable, filled with a dawning affection that made Amelia's heart soar. "Oh, Jedediah," she whispered, her own eyes filling with tears. I never thought." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a tear from her cheek. Maybe we both been given a second chance, Amelia. A chance for something good, something real." In the heart of the wilderness, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, their marriage of convenience was transforming, blossoming into a love that was as unexpected and resilient as the wildflowers that bloomed on the high mountain slopes. It was a love born not of youthful passion or societal expectation, but of shared hardship, mutual respect, and a deep, quiet understanding of each other's wounded souls. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of grueling travel, Jedediah led them through a narrow, almost invisible pass, choked with ancient, wind-twisted pines, and into a valley that took Amelia's breath away. It was a hidden jewel, nestled high in the mountains, untouched, pristine. A clear, sparkling river flowed through lush green meadows, dotted with groves of aspen and pine. Jagged, snow-capped peaks surrounded the valley, creating a natural fortress, a sanctuary. Game was plentiful. Deer grazed peacefully in the meadows. Elk tracks were visible near the riverbank. The air was clean, crisp, smelling of pine and wildflowers and rich earth. "This is it, Amelia," Jedediah said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence, a sense of homecoming. "This is Sanctuary Valley." A different sanctuary than the creek Clara Evans had sought, for true sanctuaries are often found, not sought through advertisements. "My father, he was a trapper, knew these mountains like the back of his hand. He showed me this place when I was just a boy, said it was a place where a man could find peace, where the world couldn't reach him. I never thought I'd bring anyone else here." He looked at her, a question in his eyes. Amelia gazed around, her heart swelling with a profound sense of peace, of belonging. This wasn't just a refuge, it was a promise of a new life, a true home, shared with this quiet, strong man who had, against all odds, captured her heart. It's beautiful, Jedediah," she whispered. "It's perfect." They found a sheltered spot near the river, protected by a grove of tall pines, and began the arduous task of building a new life from scratch. They felled trees, built a small, sturdy cabin, chinked it with mud and moss against the coming winter. They cleared land for a garden, planted the few seeds they had carried with them. They hunted, fished, gathered edible plants, their days filled with hard work, shared purpose, and a growing, quiet contentment. The first winter in Sanctuary Valley was harsh, but they faced it together, their small cabin a haven of warmth and companionship. Amelia's books were read aloud again, her voice weaving stories that filled the long, dark evenings, Jedediah listening intently, his hand often finding hers in the firelight. Shadow, ever loyal, lay at their feet, a furry guardian, content in his new domain. They were isolated, yes, cut off from the outside world, but they were not lonely. They had each other. They had found their sanctuary. But the outside world and the shadows of the past were not entirely forgotten. Jedediah knew Silas Croft was not a man to give up easily. Even if Blackwood and his men remained in Sheriff Thompson's jail, and there was no guarantee they would, Croft's money could buy many things, including lenient judges or careless guards. Croft himself was still out there, nursing his grievance, plotting his revenge. Sanctuary Valley was hidden, yes, but not necessarily undiscoverable. They remained vigilant, Jedediah often scouting the surrounding ridges, Amelia learning to handle the Winchester with increasing confidence, both of them aware that their peace was fragile, hard-won, and might need to be defended again. One crisp spring morning, nearly a year after they had arrived in Sanctuary Valley, Jedediah returned from a scouting trip, his face unusually grim. He carried a worn, leather-bound journal. "Found this," he said, handing it to Amelia. "Hidden in an old trapper's cache, down near the southern pass. Looks like it belonged to Silas Croft." Amelia opened the journal with trembling hands. The handwriting was familiar, Croft's arrogant scrawl. It was a record of his early prospecting days, his partnership with Jedediah, his relentless ambition. And then, the damning entries. Details of his plan to cheat Jedediah out of the rich silver claim, his cold-blooded ambush, his leaving Jedediah for dead, his subsequent use of the stolen wealth to build his Nevada empire. It was all there, in Croft's own hand, irrefutable proof of his treachery, his crimes. Why Croft had kept such a damning record, why he hadn't destroyed it, was a mystery, perhaps arrogance, perhaps a twisted need to document his triumphs. How it had ended up in a forgotten trapper's cache in the Bighorns was another puzzle, perhaps lost or stolen years ago, perhaps even planted there by someone who knew its significance and hoped it might one day surface. This changes everything, Jedediah," Amelia breathed, looking up at him, her eyes wide. "This is proof. Proof that could destroy Croft, clear your name completely." Jedediah nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Reckon so. But what do we do with it, Amelia? Take it back to Willow Creek? To the law? Croft's still a powerful man. He's got lawyers, money. He could bury this, discredit it, maybe even turn it against us." He looked out at their peaceful valley, at the cabin they had built, the garden they had planted, the life they were forging together. "We found our peace here. Do we risk it all? Stir up that hornet's nest again, just for vengeance, or an old man's tarnished reputation?" The dilemma was profound. The journal offered a chance for ultimate justice, for Croft's final downfall. But it also meant re-engaging with the corrupt, dangerous world they had fled, risking their hard-won sanctuary, their fragile happiness. What was more important? Public vindication or private peace? The choice, Amelia realized, wasn't just Jedediah's, it was theirs, together. The emotional twist wasn't a betrayal, but the discovery of a weapon that could bring ultimate justice, yet also threatened to destroy the very peace they had fought so hard to achieve. It was a choice between reclaiming a lost past and protecting a precious present, a choice that would define the future of their unlikely love and their hidden sanctuary. The discovery of Silas Croft's journal threw Jedediah and Amelia into a turmoil of conflicting emotions and difficult choices. For days they debated, their peaceful valley suddenly charged with the unresolved ghosts of Jedediah's past. To pursue justice against Croft, armed with this undeniable proof, felt like a moral imperative, a chance to finally see the man who had stolen so much from Jedediah face a reckoning. It was a chance to clear Jedediah's name definitively, to reclaim the honor Croft had tried to destroy. Yet the risks were immense. Croft was still a powerful, ruthless man. Re-entering his world, even with such damning evidence, meant exposing themselves to his vengeance, to the corruption his money could buy. It meant leaving the sanctuary they had built, the fragile peace they had found, and plunging back into a world of danger and uncertainty. Amelia, remembering the casual cruelty of Blackwood and his men, the fear that had gripped her, felt a deep reluctance to leave the safety of Sanctuary Valley. Here, they were self-sufficient, protected by the mountains, their lives their own. Why risk it all for an old grievance, however just? "We have a life here, Jedediah," she argued gently one evening as they sat by the fire, the journal lying like a coiled snake between them. "A good life. Croft can't reach us here. Let the past stay buried. Let him have his ill-gotten gains. We have what matters, each other, this valley, our peace." Jedediah listened, his gaze troubled. He understood her fears, shared her love for their hidden sanctuary. But the journal, it was a constant reminder of Croft's treachery, of the justice denied him for so long. And it wasn't just about him. "Croft's still out there, Amelia," he said, his voice low and grim. "Still hurting people, likely. Still building his empire on lies and stolen dreams. Men like him, they don't stop, lest they're stopped, leaving him be. It feels like letting him win. Again." He touched the old scar on his cheek, a reminder of Croft's brutality. "And what about others? How many more will he cheat, ruin, maybe even kill, if someone don't stand up to him?" His words resonated with Amelia's own sense of justice, the principles her father had instilled in her. She thought of the fear in Willow Creek, the powerlessness of Sheriff Thompson against men like Blackwood, who were merely Croft's pawns. Could they, in good conscience, remain hidden, knowing they held the means to expose such a man, to prevent further harm? The peace of Sanctuary Valley suddenly felt less like a refuge and more like a gilded cage, if it meant turning a blind eye to ongoing injustice. Their debate was interrupted by an unexpected arrival. Shadow, who had been scouting the lower valley, returned with urgent barks, leading them to the edge of the pass where they had first entered. A lone rider was struggling up the trail, his horse near exhaustion. As he drew closer, Jedediah recognized him with a start. It was Sheriff Thompson from Willow Creek. The sheriff was haggard, his clothes trail-worn, his face grim. He nearly fell from his horse as Jedediah and Amelia rushed to help him. "Cutler, Miss Hathaway, thank God I found you," he gasped, accepting the water Amelia offered. "Trouble. Big trouble back in Willow Creek. And it concerns Croft." He told them a chilling story. Blackwood and his wounded man had escaped from the Willow Creek jail, almost certainly with help bought by Croft's money. They had vanished. But a few weeks later, a new group of hard cases, even more ruthless than Blackwood's crew, had ridden into Willow Creek. They weren't directly threatening the town, not yet. They were using it as a base, making inquiries, asking about Jedediah Cutler, about a woman fitting Amelia's description, showing old tintypes. They were clearly hunting them, systematically searching the surrounding territory. And they were led by a man known throughout the territories for his cold-blooded efficiency, a notorious enforcer named Reno, a man who worked exclusively for the highest bidder, often for men like Silas Croft. "They haven't found this valley yet," Sheriff Thompson concluded, his voice heavy with worry. "But it's only a matter of time. Reno's like a damn bloodhound, and Croft, he's clearly not letting this go. He wants you silenced, Cutler, permanently, and probably the missus too, for what she witnessed." He looked from Jedediah to Amelia, his expression filled with concern. "You ain't safe here, not anymore." The sheriff's news shattered their dilemma, replacing it with a stark, immediate reality. Their sanctuary was no longer secure. Croft's vengeance was actively seeking them out. The choice was no longer between peace and justice. It was between facing the threat head-on or running again, deeper into the wilderness, always looking over their shoulders, their peace forever compromised. Jedediah looked at Croft's journal, then at Amelia, then at the weary sheriff. The lines on his face seemed to deepen, but his eyes held a new, cold resolve. "No more runnin'," he said quietly, his voice like steel. "Croft wants a reckoning. He'll get one, but it'll be on our terms, not his." He picked up the journal. This is our weapon, and Willow Creek. Maybe that's our battleground." The plan that formed was audacious, dangerous, relying on surprise, courage, and the hope that the truth, when finally revealed, would be powerful enough to overcome Croft's network of fear and corruption. They couldn't fight Croft's men directly in an open battle. Reno's crew was too numerous, too well armed. But they could use Croft's own weapon, his reputation, his carefully constructed facade of respectability, against him. Jedediah, Amelia, and Sheriff Thompson would return to Willow Creek, not as fugitives, but as accusers. They would present Croft's journal, his own damning words, to the town, to whatever legal authority existed beyond Sheriff Thompson's limited reach. Perhaps the circuit judge, due in a few weeks, or even appeal to the territorial governor if necessary. They would expose Croft for the thief, the cheat, the would-be murderer he truly was. Their hope was that public exposure, backed by irrefutable proof, would shatter Croft's power base, turn his allies against him, and force the law to act, even against such an influential man. It was a desperate gamble. Reno and his men were still in or near Willow Creek. Croft, if alerted, would undoubtedly try to silence them before they could speak. But it was their only chance to end the threat permanently, not just for themselves, but for anyone else who might fall victim to Croft's greed. Amelia, though terrified at the thought of returning to the town that had scorned her, of facing armed killers, found a new strength in Jedediah's resolve, in the justice of their cause. She would not be a frightened mail-order bride cowering in the wilderness. She was Jedediah Cutler's wife, his partner, and she would stand by him, whatever the cost. She carefully wrapped Croft's journal in oilskin, tucking it deep within her saddlebag. It felt like holding a stick of dynamite. They left Sanctuary Valley the next morning, a small, determined party of 3, shadow scouting ahead, their faces set towards Willow Creek, towards a confrontation that would decide their fate, and perhaps the fate of justice in that corner of the Wyoming Territory. The peace of their hidden valley was left behind, exchanged for the uncertain, dangerous path of seeking truth and reckoning in a world that often preferred comfortable lies and the rule of the powerful. Their return to Willow Creek was carefully orchestrated. Sheriff Thompson rode in first, openly, resuming his duties, trying to gauge the situation, to see if Reno and his men were still in town, to assess the mood of the community. Jedediah and Amelia remained hidden in a secluded coulee a few miles out, waiting for his signal. The plan was for Thompson to arrange a town meeting, a common enough occurrence, ostensibly to discuss some mundane civic matter. At that meeting, when a good portion of the town was gathered, including hopefully some of Reno's men if they were still present, Jedediah and Amelia would make their unexpected appearance, present their evidence, and appeal directly to the community's sense of justice. It was risky, relying on the element of surprise and the hope that the townsfolk, when confronted with the truth, would stand with them against Croft's hired guns. Sheriff Thompson found Willow Creek tense, uneasy. Reno and several of his men were indeed still in town, lounging in the saloon, their presence a quiet, menacing occupation. They seemed to be waiting, watching, perhaps for news from their scouts, perhaps for further orders from Croft. The townsfolk were fearful, subdued, avoiding the strangers, going about their business with nervous haste. Thompson knew he had to act quickly before Reno grew suspicious or decided to take more aggressive action. He spread the word of a town meeting to be held that evening in the small, newly built schoolhouse, the largest public building. The stated purpose was to discuss repairs to the community well, a plausible enough excuse. He made sure word reached Reno and his men, hoping their curiosity or their orders to monitor all town activities would draw them there. As dusk settled over Willow Creek, the schoolhouse began to fill. Townsfolk arrived, their faces anxious, whispering amongst themselves. Reno and 3 of his men swaggered in, taking seats near the back, their expressions arrogant, watchful. Sheriff Thompson stood at the front, looking nervous but resolute. He began speaking about the well, his voice slightly strained. Outside, hidden in the deepening shadows, Jedediah and Amelia waited, listening. This was the moment. Jedediah squeezed Amelia's hand, a silent gesture of reassurance. She clutched the oilskin-wrapped journal tightly. Shadow lay at her feet, alert, sensing the tension. Just as Sheriff Thompson finished his rambling preamble about well repairs and was about to give the prearranged signal, a specific cough, the schoolhouse door burst open. But it wasn't Jedediah and Amelia. It was Silas Croft himself. He strode into the room, flanked by 2 more of his armed retainers, his face a mask of cold fury. He must have been alerted somehow, perhaps by a rider from Reno or by his own network of informants. He had ridden hard, arriving just in time to confront them. "An interesting meeting, Sheriff Thompson," Croft sneered, his eyes sweeping the stunned room, settling on the lawman. "Perhaps you'd care to explain what other business you intended to discuss tonight?" Sheriff Thompson, though clearly shocked by Croft's unexpected appearance, stood his ground. "This is a public meeting, Croft," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Open to all citizens of Willow Creek." "Indeed," Croft said, his voice dripping sarcasm. "And I, as a concerned citizen, have some business to discuss myself. Business concerning thieves, claim jumpers, and perhaps even murderers who have been spreading slanderous lies about honest men." His gaze flicked towards the door, as if expecting someone. This was not part of the plan. Croft's arrival had preempted their surprise. Jedediah and Amelia, listening from outside, exchanged a desperate look. They had to act now, or lose their chance. Jedediah pushed open the schoolhouse door and stepped inside, Amelia close behind him, Shadow at her heels. A collective gasp went through the room. All eyes turned towards them. Reno and his men tensed, their hands moving towards their guns. Croft's eyes widened in momentary surprise, then narrowed into slits of pure hatred. "Well, well," Croft said softly, a dangerous smile playing on his lips. "Look who decided to join the party, Jedediah Cutler and his accomplice." He gestured contemptuously towards Amelia. "Thought you'd learned your lesson, old man. Thought you'd crawled away to die in the mountains." "Not dead yet, Croft," Jedediah said, his voice calm, resonant, filling the suddenly silent room. He stepped forward, Amelia beside him, holding up the oilskin-wrapped journal. "And we brought something of yours. Something you might have misplaced." Croft's eyes fixed on the journal, his smile vanishing, replaced by a flicker of something that looked like fear. He knew what it was. "Lies! Forgeries!" Croft spat, recovering quickly. "That old man's touched in the head, and this woman, a fortune hunter, a liar, trying to ruin an honest man's reputation." He turned to the townsfolk. "Don't listen to them. They're criminals, fugitives." "Are we, Croft?" Amelia spoke then, her voice surprisingly clear and strong, cutting through his bluster. She unwrapped the journal, holding it open. "Or is the real criminal the man who wrote these words? The man who detailed in his own hand how he cheated his partner, stole his claim, left him for dead? The man who hired killers like Blackwood and Reno to silence anyone who threatened to expose his crimes?" She looked directly at the townsfolk, her gaze sweeping over their shocked, uncertain faces. "We have the proof right here. Proof of Silas Croft's treachery. Proof of his guilt." Reno and his men started to move, to draw their weapons. But Sheriff Thompson was ready. "Hold it!" he roared, his own gun suddenly appearing in his hand, aimed squarely at Reno. "This is a town meeting under my authority. There'll be no gunplay here. Everyone stays calm." Several of the townsmen, emboldened by the sheriff's stand and the shocking revelations, moved to support him, a few even drawing their own concealed handguns. Farmers, merchants, ordinary men, suddenly finding their courage. Croft, seeing the tide turning, seeing the shock and dawning anger on the faces of the townsfolk who had once respected or feared him, seemed to realize his power was crumbling. His arrogance faltered. He looked trapped, desperate. "This is a fabrication," he yelled, his voice cracking. "A conspiracy. These people are trying to destroy me." "The truth will destroy you, Croft," Jedediah said quietly. "And the truth is in this book." He held it out toward Sheriff Thompson. "Read it, Sheriff. Read it to the town. Let them decide who the real criminal is." The climax was not a gunfight, though the threat of violence hung heavy in the air. It was a confrontation of truth against lies, of courage against corruption, played out not in a dusty street, but in a crowded schoolhouse, before the stunned eyes of an entire community. The journal, Silas Croft's own words, became the weapon. His carefully constructed facade of respectability shattered by the weight of his own documented treachery. Jedediah and Amelia, the aging rancher and his mail-order bride, had faced down their powerful enemy, armed not just with a gun, but with the undeniable power of the truth and the courage to speak it, even in the face of death. The fate of Silas Croft and the future of Willow Creek now rested in the hands of its citizens and the tattered pages of a forgotten journal. The silence in the schoolhouse was absolute, broken only by Croft's ragged breathing and the rustle of pages as Sheriff Thompson, his face grim, began to read aloud from the damning journal. He didn't read it all, just key passages. Croft's gleeful account of striking rich silver, his cold calculation of how to dispose of his partner, Jedediah Cutler, his later entries detailing shady land deals, intimidation of smaller ranchers, his utter contempt for the law and common decency. Each word fell like a hammer blow, dismantling Croft's carefully constructed image, revealing the ruthless, amoral core beneath. The townsfolk listened, their initial shock turning to a quiet, simmering fury. These were people who valued honesty, hard work, fair dealing. Croft had violated every principle they held dear. Men who had once tipped their hats to him now stared with open hostility. Women who had perhaps envied his wealth now looked at him with disgust. Even Reno and his remaining men, seeing their employer so thoroughly exposed, their own association with him now a dangerous liability, began to look uneasy, their arrogance replaced by a wary watchfulness. When Sheriff Thompson finally finished reading, a low murmur of outrage swept through the room. That viper," someone yelled. "He ain't fit to live among decent folk," another added. The mood was turning ugly, threatening to spill over into mob violence. "Hold on now." Sheriff Thompson raised his hand, his voice firm, commanding attention. "We do things by the law here in Willow Creek, even for men like him." He looked directly at Croft, who stood pale and trembling, his usual arrogance completely gone. "Silas Croft, under the authority of Wyoming Territory, I am placing you under arrest. For conspiracy, for theft, for attempted murder, and for whatever else the circuit judge deems fit after he reads this here journal." He gestured towards Jedediah and Amelia. "And these two, Mr. and Mrs. Cutler. They are under the protection of this town. Any man who tries to harm them will answer to me, and to all of us." He looked around at the townsfolk and saw a sea of nodding, determined faces. The community, once divided by gossip and fear, was now united by shared outrage and a common sense of justice. Reno and his men, seeing the situation was hopeless, that the town was solidly against them, and their paymaster was finished, wisely chose not to resist. They allowed themselves to be disarmed by the sheriff and his newly deputized townsmen, their expressions sullen, defeated. The threat they had posed to Willow Creek and to the Cutlers was over. Silas Croft was locked in the town's small, sturdy jail, awaiting the arrival of the circuit judge. His power, built on lies and intimidation, had crumbled in a single evening, brought down by the courage of two people he had underestimated and the damning evidence of his own words. In the days that followed, Willow Creek was a changed town. The fear and suspicion that had once permeated its dusty streets were replaced by a sense of shared purpose, of community rediscovered. Jedediah and Amelia Cutler were no longer outcasts, objects of scorn or pity. They were heroes, symbols of resilience, of quiet courage, of the triumph of truth over treachery. The townsfolk, ashamed of their earlier judgments, went out of their way to offer friendship, help, respect. Sarah Carter, the sheriff's wife, organized a quilting bee to make new, warm blankets for the Cutlers, a gesture of welcome and apology. The mercantile owner, Mr. Henderson, a different Henderson than the one from the previous tale, but of a similar stock perhaps, offered them unlimited credit. Jedediah and Amelia, overwhelmed by the town's sudden change of heart, accepted the kindness with quiet gratitude. They didn't return to the lazy sea immediately. It held too many recent memories of fear and violence. Instead, they stayed for a time in a small cabin offered to them by Sheriff Thompson, resting, recovering, allowing the events to settle. The journal, the source of so much turmoil, was locked safely in the sheriff's office, awaiting the judge. They found themselves spending hours talking, truly talking, not just about the past, but about the future. Their future. The shared danger, the public vindication, had stripped away the last vestiges of awkwardness between them. Their bond, forged in the wilderness and tested in the crucible of confrontation, was now unbreakable. A deep, quiet love rooted in mutual respect, shared experience, and a profound understanding of each other's worth. The age gap, once a source of societal scorn and their own private anxieties, seemed to have become irrelevant, meaningless in the face of what they had endured and overcome together. When the circuit judge finally arrived, Silas Croft's trial was swift. The journal, authenticated and supported by Jedediah's testimony and the accounts of Blackwood's earlier attack. Blackwood himself, having perhaps found his own conscience or simply wanting to save his own skin, turned witness against his former employer. Left no room for doubt. Croft was found guilty on multiple charges and sentenced to a long term in the territorial prison, his ill-gotten empire destined to be broken up and sold off to satisfy his debts and compensate his victims. Justice, however slow, however flawed, had finally been served. With Croft's conviction, a true peace settled over Willow Creek and over Jedediah and Amelia. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. They faced a future that was uncertain, yes, but also filled with a new sense of possibility. They could return to the lazy sea, rebuild it, make it their own. Or they could choose a different path, perhaps even return to the wild beauty of Sanctuary Valley, the place where their love had truly taken root. The choice was theirs, to make together. One cool autumn evening, as the first stars began to prick the twilight sky, they stood on the porch of their temporary cabin in Willow Creek, looking out at the vast, silent land. Jedediah took Amelia's hand, his grip strong, reassuring. Reckon we made it, Amelia," he said, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. "Yes, Jedediah," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder, a sense of profound peace settling in her heart. "We made it." Shadow, ever present, lay at their feet, his tail thumping softly against the wooden planks, a furry embodiment of their shared journey, their enduring loyalty. The whispers of Willow Creek were finally silenced, replaced by the quiet murmur of a love that had defied age, scorn, and danger, a love as resilient and enduring as the Wyoming land itself. And so, the story of Jedediah Cutler and Amelia Hathaway comes to its quiet close. A tale that reminds us, powerfully, that the heart knows no arithmetic, that love can blossom in the most unexpected seasons of life, defying societal norms and transcending the superficial judgments of others. Theirs was a marriage begun in pragmatism, shadowed by an age gap that set tongues wagging, yet it transformed, through shared hardship and discovered courage, into a bond of profound depth and true affection. It speaks to us about looking beyond the surface, doesn't it? Willow Creek saw an old man and a young woman and leaped to conclusions fueled by gossip and prejudice. They failed to see the quiet strength in Jedediah, the resilience in Amelia, the potential for a genuine connection between two lonely souls who had both known their share of sorrow. It's a timeless reminder, friends, to be wary of snap judgments, to seek understanding rather than rushing to condemn, to recognize that the measure of a person and a partnership lies not in how it appears to the world, but in the truth and loyalty found within. Their journey also highlights the corrosive power of past grievances, personified by Silas Croft. His inability to let go of an old betrayal, his relentless pursuit of vengeance, ultimately led to his own downfall. It's a stark illustration of how bitterness can poison a life, how the refusal to forgive or to seek true justice rather than mere retribution can consume and destroy. Jedediah and Amelia, in contrast, found their strength not in dwelling on past wrongs, but in building a future together, in defending what was theirs with courage and integrity. And what of courage? Amelia, the genteel woman from back east, discovered a warrior spirit she never knew she possessed, defending her home, her husband, with unexpected ferocity. Jedediah, the aging rancher, found the strength to confront the ghosts of his past, to fight for his present, to embrace a second chance at love and happiness. Their story teaches us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it, to stand for what matters, even when the odds seem insurmountable. This tale is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the enduring power of love and partnership to overcome adversity. It reminds us that true sanctuary is found not just in a hidden valley or a sturdy cabin, but in the shelter of a loving heart, in the strength of a shared commitment. It's about finding common ground, even across the divides of age or experience, and building a life based on mutual respect, trust, and unwavering loyalty. Out here, in the vast tapestry of the American West, stories like Jedediah and Amelia's are woven with threads of hardship, courage, and unexpected grace. They remind us that love often arrives in surprising packages, that partnerships can be forged in the most unlikely circumstances, and that the human heart, like the prairie wildflower, can find a way to bloom even in the harshest, most unforgiving terrain. If this story of a love that defied convention and triumphed over adversity has warmed your own heart, if it has made you think about the true nature of companionship and the courage it takes to build a life against the grain, I invite you to share it. Let their story be a beacon for others who might be facing their own judgments, their own lonely paths. We'd be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What does it mean to truly see another person, beyond age, beyond appearance, beyond societal expectation? And as always, if you wish to continue this journey with us, exploring more tales that delve into the rich complexities of the human experience as it unfolded on the frontier, these voices of justice that echo with timeless truths, please, do subscribe. We'll keep the fire lit and a story waiting for you. Until next time, friends, may you have the wisdom to look past the surface, the courage to embrace love in all its forms, and the strength to build your own sanctuary, wherever you may find it, with whomever shares your heart. This is your narrator, wishing you warmth, companionship, and a love as enduring as the mountains.